So let me introduce my panelists, and we're also going to be joined on Zoom from Kyiv by Yuriy Belousov, who's right there. Please also Wayne and Wayne Jordash and Eugene Finkel should also come on stage. Yuriy, good to see you. Can you hear us?
Good to see you guys. Yes, I hear you.
Okay.
Sometimes I had connection, but looks like it's okay now.
I think that works. Okay, great. So our three panelists today for a conversation about obviously what's going on now and how we will deal with this conflict going forward from the point of view of law as well as a sort of war. Yuriy Belousov is the head of the department that's investigating human rights violations in the Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine. Wayne Jordash is the president of the Global Rights Compliance Foundation and has worked at multiple tribunals on conflicts on the former Yugoslavia, Cambodia, and others, and I guess the ICC as well in The Hague. And Eugene Finkel is a professor at SAIS in Bologna, the School of Advanced International Studies of Johns Hopkins. Perhaps, Yuriy, I could begin with you, since you are on the ground. Could you give us an overview of the Ukrainian government's current approach to investigating what is happening or has happened in the last 3 months in Ukraine?
Okay, thank you so much for the questions. So it's a pleasure for me to be here with all of you. As you all know, so today it's exactly 3 months since this stage of war started, because as you all know, the war started in 2014. So we just talk about the next stage of the war. So for these 3 months, Ukraine faced with a huge number of crimes we never had before. That's why it was a huge challenge for the whole law enforcement system, which had to readjust to the change of reality and the types of crimes we are surrounded right now. So for these 3 months, we already registered 13,000 crimes related to the war. We already have suspects, so we have more than 600 suspects in our investigations. During this war, maybe just to add some figures, just officially proven more than 4,500 civilians who were killed, more than 200 children were killed, and more than 400 were injured. That's why we are facing the situation when the civilians are suffering from the actions of Russian soldiers, and which we definitely have to investigate. As to the challenges, maybe, as I said, for this pretty short period of time, the whole law enforcement system had to readjust, and we started to mainly focus on war crimes. That's why we were in great need of international support, who are experts in humanitarian law, who actually told us what the specific of these times of investigation. And we investigating, and we are studying at the same time. Coming back to the types of crimes, so I could just give you maybe some figures, because we classified what kind of crimes we are facing out of these 13,000. So it's more than 6,000 cases where the civilian objects were attacked. It's just ordinary houses, it's just hospitals, schools, and other types of institutions. Around 1,000 deliberate murders. 800 cases of ill treatment and illegal detention. And actually we see that this illegal detention and ill treatment, it's like a common approach, let's say, of Russian soldiers towards civilian populations. We have lots of cases of sexual crimes, which is also just even terrible even to discuss this case, because children could be victims, very small children could be victims of sexual crimes. That's when we read it, it's like a terrible movie that we never expected that it could be in reality. But right now, I think that the system is already ready to be more effective. For these 3 months, with the involvement of our international experts, we have trained lots of guys, prosecutors, investigators, guys working for police, for security service, for even National Anti-Corruption Bureau. Even these guys now are documenting war crimes. So it's all like all together working as a big law enforcement family, if I can say that. As to the suspects, so I said it's more than 600 guys, but 52 of them were charged already in Ukraine for war crimes. So, and a couple of days ago, we even had a national court verdict. It's the first verdict on the Russian soldiers who are physically now present in Ukraine. We were sentenced to a life term imprisonment. For us, it's very important because the main task and main focus for our investigation is national courts. Because sure, we work, and maybe a colleague of mine, they would further tell you more about the international courts and the system of working with these institutions. But our law enforcement is mostly focused on national courts. That's why we really want to bring these guys who have committed such terrible crimes accountable in our national courts. Sure, it's pretty difficult. Sure, not all of them are here. But fortunately, due to new technologies, due to modern investigation techniques, now it's much more easy to establish who this guy is, even if he is in Russia now. But we would definitely know who is this guy. We would try to, to establish as much problems to him if he or she would try to leave their country. And sure, we believe that we would have a chance to bring them accountable to Ukrainian courts.
Yuriy, you're still in the middle of fighting a war, and a very active war. And I wonder, why is it important for the government to also do these investigations, which take up resources and time, when the conflict is not even seemingly close to being over?
I think there are several reasons for that. First of them, that's just even to support victims, because victims we have thousands of victims now, they should feel that the justice exists even in these conditions. They should feel that the perpetrators will not just go freely after what they've done here. That's the first reason. Second one, we really want the other soldiers who didn't commit war crimes to understand that if they do that, they would be punished for that. If they don't, they would be exchanged and sent home back freely. Because if they didn't commit a war crime, it's just a combatants, so they should know that they will not be punished in Ukraine. That's why it's like prevention. We believe that they will behave properly even during the war, because as we all know that even the war has its rules. That's why soldiers should understand. And another is very practical thing that we could do right now, because we would lose evidences. Because as you know, when I'm here again. So as you know, in these types of crime, evidences and the speediness of the investigation is just crucial. Because when we have a deoccupied territory, if we will not make a crime search analysis, if we will not collect evidences next day or as short as possible, we just will lose them. And these guys will stay unpunishable for that.
Maybe I can turn here to Wayne, because the ICTY, if memory serves right, was created in 1992, long before the Yugoslav wars were over. And I wonder if you look back at the experience of that tribunal, but also other conflicts that you've worked on, what are the lessons that Ukraine maybe should take away, or we should take away, that was done well, or that were some of the mistakes that were made in trying to prosecute war crimes in the middle of the conflict, and also what happened afterwards?
Well, thank you for the invite to be at this panel. The answer to the question is a complicated one, but I would say the first thing is patience. I think it's incredibly difficult to investigate these crimes outside of a conflict. In the middle of it, it is frankly next to impossible. And I think, for example, the Prosecutor General and the Office of the Prosecution have done a great job just even bringing a case. That's highly unusual. It's not unprecedented, but it's almost unprecedented. In order to build these cases, you need a variety of skills. You need a variety of different techniques. You need a significant number of people. So to do that in an ongoing conflict, and I think if you look at the ICTY, I think it actually began in 1994. The reality is it didn't start a caseload until 1999-2000. It had spent years trying to build cases. If you look at every single institution, every single international tribunal, and most of them have more resources than Ukraine has. They all take a very long time. The ICC has spent $1 billion in the last 20 years, and it has 4 convictions or 5 convictions to its name. So this is an incredibly complicated, I mean, it's not just because it's complicated. There are other reasons, but it is complicated. It is a symptom of its complexity that it does take a long time. I mean, if you look again at the Special Court for Sierra Leone, they tried 10 people over the space of, I think, 8 years. So patience is the first thing. I think taking your time and not putting the prosecution under too much pressure. I know that there's a huge amount of pressure on the prosecution right now. I'm not so sure that it's helpful, in fact. I think slow and steady wins the race.
Do you think it's a good idea even to start this early? And is there a danger with I guess the case they had this week that it was be seen as one out of thousands, but also it could be easily seen as being political rather than just?
Well, there's definitely a danger. International tribunals will purport that politics do not play a part. But if you map what happens at international tribunals, you'll see that the trials get fairer and fairer and fairer the further away you get from the conflict. It is very difficult to be acquitted at an international tribunal when you're next to the conflict. Institutions take a long time to become confident enough to actually look at the evidence more impartially and independently and have the confidence to say, actually, an acquittal is also a good sign of justice working. Not everybody who's indicted is guilty. Acquittals are, or can be, a sign of the health of the system. So, of course, there is a danger. I think it has to be really carefully scrutinized. I think the trials in Ukraine at this time, for me, are a good idea for some of the reasons that Yuriy spoke about. But I think we have to be extremely careful. The prosecution has to be extremely rigorous. Judges have to be extremely rigorous. It was very good, I thought, to see that a Ukrainian lawyer was representing the Russian suspect in this case. And he appears to be doing a very good job, and he appears to have been very alert to the need to be defending that person. That is a sign of a healthy system.
I would have to get Yuriy back when the internet connection resumes. Eugene, you were the first person, I think, who declared the conflict in Ukraine a genocide, since followed by President Biden. Can you just explain sort of what led you to say this is a genocidal conflict as opposed to something else?
Right, so I don't think I was the first person. I think I was the first scholar of genocide to say that it meets the criteria, but people in Ukraine, people on the ground are saying it, we're saying it almost from the very beginning of this conflict, and the problem was that people in the West were not listening to them, and only when, someone based in a school in Washington, D.C. with the name of Johns Hopkins attached to it, also happens to be a Holocaust scholar, publishing in English, says that, then suddenly the switch flips, but we and all the rest should have been listening to people on the ground saying it from the very beginning, because they knew more than we did, and they saw what we saw. But generally, I think there is, and when it comes to whether it's a genocide or not, there are several discussions here going on. One is a political discussion and a moral discussion. Another is a legal discussion among scholars. And the political discussion is obviously very important. I'm not going to touch on that. That's not my job. And politically, I think the discussion is moving in the direction of saying that it is a genocide, with President Biden and several parliaments across Europe and Canada, with some holdouts like Macron. But I think we're still getting there. But that again is a political discussion. A more substantive discussion is now going on between lawyers and historians, especially historians of genocide and historians of Eastern Europe, like myself, who are willing to call it genocide. Legal scholars are much more cautious in their approach, because they're thinking about how we convict individuals and what will pass muster at the court of law. but when it comes to people like myself, I think what we did come to understand that rhetoric matters, and when it comes to the crime of genocide, the key is to establish intent and connect it to the violence on the ground. And the rhetoric that is coming out of Moscow and have been coming out of Moscow escalated over time, and at some point in early April, it crossed this threshold from being colonial, destroying Ukraine as a state, subjugating Ukraine, to clearly genocidal, meaning destroying a national group. And national groups are protected groups under the Genocide Convention. So on the one hand, there was a clear shift in rhetoric. On the other hand, we also Bucha. And Bucha was not random. And the more we see, the more we get to know about Bucha and European and some other places, we'll see quite a lot of wanton violence, indiscriminate violence, but we also see evidence of very clear targeting of specific groups of people because of their association with Ukrainian national identity and with the Ukrainian state. So that together led me to come out and argue that it is a genocide going on, and I think this notion does get hold, and Moscow and the state officials in Moscow and the state TV are busy providing us with more than enough evidence of intent on a daily basis, crazier and crazier with every broadcast of Solovyov and other show. The key would be more people on the ground, like my panelists, to actually provide us with evidence of not just targeting, but motivation for targeting. So connect violence to intent.
Right. Maybe a question both for you and for Yuriy I think one can kind of concede your point that there's sort of genocidal rhetoric. You can read Putin's essay last summer. If you watch Orte or whatever they call it now, you sort of get the same kind of rhetoric that Ukrainians are not a nation. This is a fiction. But I wonder, are you seeing genocidal attack is there a sort of industrial genocide in some ways? Is the military behaving in a way to eliminate sort of large numbers of civilians the way you associate with obviously with World War II, but even with Cambodia, or is it not there yet? Are we seeing more random, somewhat still tragic acts of violence that are more sort of war atrocities, but there's been sort of an atrocity and a genocidal act. So I wonder if you could both maybe address that question.
So Yuriy probably knows more, so maybe you should start and then I will follow up on that.
I would just briefly add that unfortunately I'm not directly involved in this particular investigation on genocide, but that's why I could judge from my mind based on other investigations we see, which is not directly on a genocide case. But anyway, we see it's like a trend. They treat us definitely because of the ethnic or national origin of Ukrainians, and it's sometimes it's even. They can't even difficult for them to explain why they behave like that, because it's like a paradox of thinking. Because first they say, no, we Ukrainians are like our brothers, you just have some Nazis, and that's we are trying to find where the Nazis is. But then actually we see, and even the ambassador, I think British ambassador, showed this books have been in a fire in the school when they found the books on Ukrainian history, on Ukrainian culture, or if they see somewhere, ornament, or if they see somewhere science which show that that's a part of Ukrainian culture, they try to destroy it, flags and stuff like that. And it showed that they really didn't just come here to help us, as they say, but at the same time, this hate they have in their mind. So I think it's mostly related to Ukraine, because they really do not perceive Ukraine as a nation. It's whatever they say sometimes, we see that they think that Ukraine is like a mistake for them, and they need to correct it. And if anyone makes a resistance to that, they immediately want to kill this person or to punish. And the last comment, which is showing this, I don't know where the reason for this hate. Maybe you heard about these interceptions of the communication with families when the wife, one soldier, so he asked him to rape Ukrainian women. The wife said to her husband to rape Ukrainian women. So this Ukrainian women, it means it's like they deliberately want to make a harm to Ukrainians. From my perspective, it could be considered as a genocide science, but sure, the experts in this particular sphere would provide more comments, I think.
But maybe I should just sort of amplifying that question a little bit is you are diverting military resources, to put it sort of bluntly, if you are trying to kill civilians indiscriminately and carry out atrocities, which presumably detracts from your ability to kind of make gains on the front where Russia has serious shortcomings. Are we seeing kind of Russian troops being organized around carrying out civilian atrocities, or is that kind of more collateral damage out of that comes out of the war, and they misbehave in the villages which they occupy?
If it's a question to me, sorry, I would try to. It's like a part of policy. It's like an organized system. We see, for example, when the occupies, we have one of the cases when they in a small village in the Kyiv region, the territory was occupied on the village, and they captured like 70 local people, immediately put them in the basement and started to interrogate actually. The interview is maybe too soft term. And when they get any sign that these guys could be a problem, let's say, for them, they deport them to Russia. And in Russia, there's deliberately signed locations which were prepared in advance, where they keep Ukrainians and for further investigation, interrogation, torture, stuff like that. So it means that they prepare to such types of behavior. We already heard about this list they have. When they come, they know whom to tackle. And they know how to behave towards civilians. In one of our cases, when we have 12 guys been killed, they were killed just because they had some small suspicion that they could be somehow related to military, but they were all civilians. And it wasn't just one case. It means that they got a pretty clear instructions how to behave, what to do in the particular situations. And we think that it showed that they were well prepared for such types of treatment and behavior against civilians. It's not just like a mistake of one soldier or his misconduct. We're sure that they were given a pretty clear orders what to do. And cruelty, ill treatment were the part of these orders.
Right, so thanks, Yuriy. So to follow up on that, genocidal violence is not indiscriminate. Genocide is a policy, and to establish that, we need exactly the type of evidence that we're hearing about here, and we're also getting from journalists and eyewitnesses on the ground. Now, genocide does not mean millions of victims. It's not about numbers. Numbers need to be substantial, but we actually don't know what the substantial means practically. In the case of Srebrenica, which was recognized as a genocide, it was about 8,000 people. So the key is the intent and the specific mode of targeting, and we definitely see that. And I think the more evidence we discover, the stronger the case would be. It's not just a drunken soldier starts shooting. It's shelling of cities is a war crime. It's not genocide. Genocide is exactly what Yuriy is describing. Going with a specific policy, with a specific list of attributes of whom to target and whom to kill. That's genocidal.
I think this is a really important point to clarify and amplify. But then I wonder, who do you hold responsible, and how should, let's say, Ukraine organize itself? Are you trying to get the sergeant who shot the civilian, or are you trying to figure out who in the Kremlin was the one who was designing this policy in the first place?
For me? Okay, so I will bite first. Thank you. So obviously, the individual accountability part that Yuriy and the General Prosecutor Office are engaging in is crucial. But I think we need to think much broader than just the legal terms. Now, there is obviously individual guilt and individual accountability, and that's using the title of our panel, the road to the Hague, in a more literal sense. But as an historian, as a scholar of genocide, I'm also thinking about the Hague as a state of mind, as an idea. So individual guilt, but also collective responsibility. It's not just about this or that sergeant or this or that officer. It's not even about Putin. It's about Russia as a state, because Russian agents are engaging in that. And that's where the collective responsibility, not guilt, but responsibility comes in, and there will be no solution, there will be no accountability, there will be no healing until that acceptance of guilt comes from Russia. So earlier a short anecdote, earlier this morning there was a very insightful discussion in the Russian war crimes exhibition with mayors of Melitopol, Bucha, Mariupol, the head of the Kiev region military civilian administration, and I asked them a question that was a bit provocative, definitely premature, and maybe even offensive, but it needed to be asked just to be put on record. And the question was, well, what it will take you or your children or your grandchildren to start rebuilding relations with Russia? And the answer was, as of now, nothing. And to change that, to have, for the sake of the healing of Ukraine, we need to push not just individual guilt, but also Russian collective responsibility, because only they can give Ukraine this chance of healing. And that's why it's important to, to broaden the picture.
Wait, I actually want to turn to you, but we lost Yuriy, so let me turn to you. So if we assume that there is clear intent to do this, sorry, you're back. Let me just quickly follow up on what Eugene was saying about if it's traced back to Moscow, what is the Ukrainian state doing to try and establish sort of a chain of control? How much time are you spending? Obviously, you've been investigating individual cases, but who is and how are you trying to kind of get at the, the sort of command line to sort of to understand the sort of command chain and how these decisions are made and how they're passed down and who is giving the orders as opposed to just executing them?
Yeah, that's a specific of war crimes, that here the perpetrator is not the guy who exactly committed the crime, but the whole chain of command need to be analyzed. And if the head of unit, military unit, which occupied a particular village, for example, he would be fully responsible for what his soldiers have done on this territory. And that's the specific of their responsibility. Sure, we are working on the specific is that we should exactly prove which particular military unit was there, which particular military unit was there at a specific time, because it could be several units which passed one against another. And the soldier of one of them could commit a crime. That's why this unit should be identified. And there could be different sources how we do that. So sure, starting from the information of the military intelligence until the, analysis of radio communications and stuff like that. But in addition, Russian soldiers, they definitely didn't expect that they would investigate. That's why they leave lots of different personal belongings, and sometimes we even find these personal documents which show exactly who were there. And sure, in addition that it's like open source analysis, different analysis. But for us, it's very important, as I said, to identify a very specific military unit which was in a particular place in a particular time. And fortunately, so current possibilities of the investigations give us these chances. Another source of information, which, if I may just briefly comment, which is pretty new for us, I think, that the help of journalist community. And we have so many different investigative journalists who came to our country and who tried to gather as much information as possible, and that's very effective. And that's why we got information even from them. They could be more effective in some particular respect of the investigation, which is additional source of information for us.
Right. Super. Wayne, I'm curious, do you think Ukraine do we need an international tribunal on Ukraine? Or will we need one down the road?
You mean an additional one? Because we do have the ICC.
Who's going to indict Vladimir Putin? Maybe that's the other question.
Well, I think you have to look at the investigation and prosecution of these crimes as a collaborative effort. Ukraine should stay at the forefront. Trials should happen as close to where the crimes occurred. That's what we've learned over the last 20, 25 years of international criminal law. They should be accessible to the people who are affected by them. But at the same time, look at the massive crimes that have occurred in Ukraine. With the best will in the world, with the best investigators and prosecutors in Ukraine, they cannot investigate and prosecute everything. In fact, probably only a fraction of the crimes can be investigated and prosecuted by Ukraine. That's true of any national system. It's incapable. All national systems are incapable of investigating and prosecuting this massive crimes. So what we have to do is look outwards to, first of all, the ICC, but we shouldn't get too excited by the ICC. We shouldn't look at it as the panacea. It's not going to investigate and prosecute more crimes than the Ukrainian prosecutor is going to. At best, if we're lucky, the Ukraine will see 25 to 30 investigators from the ICC. That's it. So then we have to look a bit further. We have to look at all the investigations which have been opened in the regional countries, from Poland to Germany to Lithuania to Estonia and so on. And we have to still accept that we probably will not be able to investigate and prosecute everything. But through that collaboration, we can do a number of things. One is we can prosecute some of them. Two, we can lay a foundation of truth and counter the misinformation. And three, what we can do is also build resilience. We can establish, and this is what I'm excited about, and I'll come to the precise answer to the question in a second. I'm excited about the fact that if we collaborate with all these institutions that are working on these cases, we can align our judicial systems across Europe. We can ensure that the legal impediments for prosecuting these cases are diminished, and there's many at the moment. Most of European countries don't have functional war crimes units. They don't have special investigators. They don't have specialist prosecutors. They need them. Germany is a good example of what can happen if a national prosecution turns around and says, we're going to prosecute cases for crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide, wherever they occur. And you'll see with Germany, they've prosecuted a significant amount, it's 60 to 100 cases from Syria. It's significant because no one else does it to that extent. So what I'm excited about is if we see these countries combine forces with the Ukrainian prosecutor, combine forces with the ICC, and build a network of accountability to confront the type of impunity that Putin's regime threatens. Do we need another tribunal for aggression? I'm not so sure. What I'd like to see is a focus on what we have. I'm frightened about another tribunal, that it starts to suck out. These international institutions can really suck out the life of what is happening at the local level. That's my concern about another international tribunal. We have an unprecedented amount of activity. Let's make it work.
Question of legitimacy, actually, of a tribunal. Where do you think it sort of lies? Which kind of, again, if you go to Yugoslavia, if you're in Serbia, the ICTY that was rigged against us. I wonder, is that how big a problem is that really for as we sort of think about, the road to the Hague or to Nuremberg or what have you, and what do you see as being the best solution there? It sounds like you don't think it's not a tribunal, and it's more kind of when it's grounded in the sovereign state, starting with Ukraine.
So the question is,
how do you address this sort of issue of legitimacy of a tribunal, especially if, there's a political and moral reason why you want to do it in Ukraine, but you're also, if you are sort of thinking of, I don't know, changing Russian minds or affecting change in Russia itself or helping Russia to one day down the road come to terms with the actions that were done in its name.
Actually, that's probably my main concern about an international tribunal for the crime of aggression. It will be set up and supported by countries that were or are too closely attached to the invasion of Iraq, which also was the crime of aggression. That may well challenge its legitimacy. It has to, I think, judicial efforts, as you say, they have to speak to people in Russia as well as everybody else. And so this is why I'm a supporter of local justice, and I'm a supporter of the justice being done within Europe as a whole, because that's, the more it's done by the more states and more authorities, the more legitimate it will be. And what you see, I think, with international tribunals, the more they're focused on a particular issue, the more they're focused on a particular set of people, the more that they're attached to certain countries, the less legitimate they appear, and also the less fair the trials are. So what's being proposed at the moment is an international tribunal for the crime of aggression. All the proponents of it are saying Russia is definitely guilty of it, which is true, of course. But, however, that's not necessarily the best basis for setting up a court and ensuring that it's legitimate. There has to be support from, for example, the Global South. If the Global South supported a tribunal of aggression, then I think my mind might change. But at the moment, if it's supported by the UK, if it's supported by the US, if it's supported by those who are attached to what happened in Iraq, I have my doubts. Will that speak to the people of Russia? And that's who we need to speak to. And if European states investigate and prosecute, that to me has the best hope of eventually seeping into the Russian people and trying to change some minds.
Yuriy, what sort of help do you and your office need from the outside world now?
First of all, we really appreciate the information which has been given outside of Ukraine. Been presented by our international partners, which is extremely important because even several months ago, so not everyone or a lot of people had about different perception of what was really going on in Ukraine, thinking that it's internal conflict, let's say. But now, fortunately, now everyone understands that it's not an internal conflict, it's armed conflict with international character. That's why we really appreciate the work of mass media, international mass media, the work how they do, and I really believe they would support us in this way in the future. If we say about the investigation, sure, the biggest support we need in it's just expertise, but the expertise what Wayne said, maybe I fully also support this idea that we shouldn't rely just on international system. We should fully rely mostly on national law enforcement system, and in that the support should be directly how to increase the capacity of national law enforcement system to effectively conduct such kind of investigation, because, which is also important, I should admit, that a lot of traditionally, maybe a lot of support was going to civil society, which is definitely a huge need to support civil society, how they document war crimes. But law enforcement system pretty often was staying behind. And we need to understand that without supporting the prosecutors, investigators, with new techniques of investigation, starting from open source analysis, which is pretty new approach for Ukrainian law enforcement system, and ending with increasing our forensic expertise. And forensic expertise, like a DNA analysis including, it's a pretty, that the sphere we would need support also. We also are now working with a lot of experts from international community, and we would need this support further in helping with specific guidelines and protocols of very specific types of investigation. And there are some expertise outside of Ukraine which we would need. We also would need expertise and even to train our prosecutors and investigators how to deal with victims of ill treatment and sexual crimes, because it's very specific and very, a specific issue, and prosecutors and investigators at least shouldn't make additional harm to these people if they're not properly trained on conduct an interview. We would definitely need, with the expertise and help, in establishing system of support of these people, which is, psychological support and other types of support of victims of crimes in Ukraine, because now we have thousands of these people. But expertise and technical support also, very, like ordinary equipment, which is also would be a great need for us. But they just made me main spheres.
Super. I do want to open up the floor to questions, and please think of questions. We'll have a microphone, I think, passed around. But let me just sort of throw one last question to Eugene from me. As a scholar of genocide, if you're looking at let's say the post-Cold War period, put what's going on in Ukraine in context vis-a-vis Yugoslavia or Syria. I sort of want to give the audience and myself a kind of a sort of understanding of the sort of scale of what we're looking at and the importance of what we're looking at too.
Right. So I think what we see in Ukraine is very different in the history of genocides, because we have several protected groups under the Genocide Convention, but typically genocide is along either religious or ethnic lines. Here I think we see first clear case of an attempted genocide aimed at a national group rather than an ethnic group. Genocide is targeting Ukrainians as a national community rather than by the ethnic belonging, and that I think is unprecedented, not only in the post-Cold War era, but also in the history of the genocide itself. And we are not, as in speaking about it as a scholar of genocide, I don't think we are well equipped to understand that. And that's also, in my view, where some of the resistance to calling this genocide is coming from, because people tend to think about genocides based either along ethnic or religious lines. Ukraine is different.
And that actually signals a more recent definition of sort of Ukrainian nationhood as like a Lipinskian definition of defining Ukraine by, common understanding of a civic society, geography and space, as opposed to language and sort of narrow ethnic identity. Who has questions? We have a microphone, and please introduce yourself and phrase it in the form of a question. So, right here, second row.
Hi. Just fascinating panel. I think your point about not inventing a new tribunal was really insightful, because we had been with Philippe Sands on a different conference just 2 weeks ago, and he was proposing
and say who you
opposite.
are.
My name is Karim, and I'm a filmmaker. We've been documenting the story of Ukraine through war crimes as one of the threads. And my question is, how do you guys think this war is testing the international law in other ways and the international systems at large, and what are the opportunities beyond inventing new systems that you think we could be seeing from this war?
It's a good question. And I spoke to Philippe. We stand on different sides on this. I spoke to him last week about this. I think the genocide question is probably, well, just stepping back from that, I think, there is a lot of talk about the ICC. There's a lot of talk about joint investigation teams supported by Eurojust. There's a lot of talk about national investigations. There's a huge amount of talk about support for the prosecution, the Ukrainian prosecution. In fact, actually, as Yuriy's suggesting, and I work with the prosecution on a daily basis, they are receiving very little help. The case that they've just prosecuted, they did it, not internationals. The ICC prosecutor gives the impression of having huge amounts of people in Ukraine. He hasn't. Eurojust gives the impression that they are involved in investigating and investigated. They're not. International experts are springing up everywhere, claiming that they are advisors to the prosecution. Maybe they are, but they're not here. They're not here as in Ukraine. So I think the challenge is to turn a lot of this rhetoric in my industry, and I'm an international criminal lawyer, and I understand my industry very well. We are very good at self-promotion. And we're less good at results. And I think the 4 convictions at the ICC over the last 20 years speak to that. So I think the challenge is turning all this rhetoric into concrete investigations on the ground in Ukraine and concrete trials. And if not trials, then doing something with that evidence to establish a historical record and using it to counter misinformation. That is the challenge. And on the genocide front, I would argue the challenge there is related to that, which is it's very complicated because it's not Rwanda, where the genocide was everywhere in the country and it was a mass killing of hundreds of thousands of people. The challenge is to investigate the patterns in Ukraine and see how a plan to discriminate, a persecutory plan, did or did not turn into a plan to destroy. And that takes hard work, and it takes a lot of mapping of the conflict, mapping from the propagandists in the Kremlin all the way down to the soldiers on the ground. And that is a challenge in itself. Instead of us international lawyers and, forgive me, Eugene, historical experts talking about it, we should get on with investigating and prove it. You know, that to me is the challenge, and I think we need to do it rather than talk about it. I am. That's why I'm in Ukraine.
May I just
30 seconds, yeah.
Yeah, 30 seconds. So to add exactly to that, and that's, I think, exactly the reasons why we should have, different conversations among historians, scholars of genocide, and lawyers and investigators. But we need to set up a system to work together and bring our complementary expertise and knowledge to bear exactly on that question. We won't be able to do it separately.
Just in the back, the gentleman with the tie, thanks.
Thank you very much. It works? Okay. This has been a very interesting
Can you say who you
discussion.
are? Sorry, just introduce yourself.
Oh, George Shapivsky. I'm representing myself.
Okay. Good to have you.
This has been a very interesting discussion, I think a very important discussion, and I'm glad it's being held and is being approached so seriously. But I have a question to whoever would like to respond here. Putin sees the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, as including Ukraine. He's written about the fact that Ukrainians are the same as Russians, that they're all related, that they're all basically one nation. Further in his logic, Ukrainians who don't accept the Ruski Mir and all that it implies, linguistically, culturally, ideologically, etc., all those are interlopers into the Ruski Mir. They're dangerous to the Ruski Mir, and therefore they are, as he calls them, Nazis, which have to be denazified. And that's been sort of the underlying justification for what he's doing from his standpoint. Now, we've been talking about...
To a question, because we have very limited time, so
okay.
please, yeah.
Oh, sorry. We've been talking about genocide, and genocide typically, and as you've been discussing, involves physical extermination of a group. You say nation, ethnic group, etc., etc. But there are other definitions that have gone to include like rape.
We have to get to a question right now because I'm going to cut you off. Yeah,
rape, etc., etc.
Yeah.
Russians are also now Russifying Ukrainians. Immediately they take territory, they change the school curriculum, they eliminate Ukrainian books. In the interest of time, I won't name everything.
We're almost running out.
They're carrying on a
Eugene, you want to take the thread
program
and
of Russification, deliberate. And wouldn't that also constitute another indicator of genocide?
So, Raphael Lemkin, a lawyer from Lviv who came up with the term genocide, would certainly see destruction of culture as a genocide. The Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide would not, because there the criteria is murdering members of the group, causing severe bodily harm, preventing reproduction, and transferring children from one group to another. Destruction of culture, unfortunately, would not apply.
Right in front, please. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a question to Yuriy Belousov. So we have established a relationship, Horizon Capital, through American Chamber of Commerce, with Prosecutor General of Ukraine in terms of setting up an office for protection of investor rights, Alexei Banyuk, et cetera. And they've done a fabulous job in terms of protecting investor rights in individual cases. And during that process, we saw that capacity was a big problem, resources, capacity. I mean, what do you need? What do you need specifically from the international community? What do you need in order to help Ukraine to prosecute these cases? Because what I'm hearing, we can't count on the international community if it's going to be 4 cases that, what does Ukraine need in terms of technical assistance, in terms of donor funding, in terms of expertise? If you had a blank slate and could have what you needed from the international community, what would it be?
No, we have a donor coordination team which works for the Office of the Prosecutor General, who they try to, to collect needs from different departments and different units, and they have list of that. That's why maybe I wouldn't substitute them just to give you a particular list of needs, but there is definitely, in terms of equipment and trainings, and Alexei Banyuk, whom you mentioned, so maybe if you could address him, I would just remind him maybe to keep in touch with you and to send this list, because it's a very specific list, and it would take time just to read what kind of trainings, what kind of particular equipments, cameras, computers, laptops, and stuff like that. They have this list. That's why, sorry, I will not give you a specific answer here.
Can I intervene here? This will be announced very soon, and it's a project that I'm working on with the Americans, with the Europeans, and with the UK. And we're creating an advisory unit of senior prosecutors who have decades of experience in the international courts, and mobile justice teams. And the mobile justice teams will contain all the core competencies that are required to investigate war crimes. These mobile justice teams, which I will be supervising, we're bringing in the first one in a couple of weeks. But just to emphasize, they are not to investigate autonomously. They are there to act as a support structure for the Prosecutor General's office, consistent with what I keep repeating, which is the Prosecutor General can do this. They need support, but every prosecution unit needs support. You need a tie-up between civil society, international experts, and the Prosecutor General's office. And if you collaborate effectively with those 3, you'll get somewhere. And that's why I'm proposing these mobile justice teams with an advisory unit. And I think it won't be perfect, it won't meet all needs, but it will meet a lot of the needs. And the question is how much will the international community fund it to create as many of these teams as possible? At the moment, we have funding for 4. You probably need about 10.
One last question right in front here.
Hello, my name is Catherine Valinga. I'm a Canadian CEO, and one of the organizations I'm supporting is Detalion, a female-led collective of about 120 women who have made it their mission to create a media database of over 1,700 verified videos and bring survivor accounts and real stories to US Congress, to the West, really aimed at the West with US, Britain, and so I really want to hear around how do we unite the efforts here, because there's so many specialties and civil activists and experts and all of the good work that you're doing there on the ground to really have a coordinated effort?
It's a very good question. I mean, the coordination, I mean, I've had more coordination meetings in the last 6 weeks than ever in my life and than ever I want in the future. However, it is absolutely critical because if you, for example, I mean, this is a very simple example, but the Rohingya, when the Rohingya were driven out of Bangladesh into Cox's Bazar in August of 2017, I think 600,000, there was little coordination of effort. And so what you had was rape victims being interviewed 15 times by journalists, human rights organizations, by the Bangladeshi investigative service. So that's a simple example of why coordination around these issues is absolutely critical. There's no simple answer, though. I think somebody joked to me the other day, there's now coordination meetings about the coordination. So I think, but I think you've got to keep trying. As tedious as some of that can be, it's forming, I think, coordination circles with like-minded agencies, organizations, those who can do, and making sure that you create structures. This is another idea about the mobile justice teams, that if we can get enough people coalesced around a single structure, then when other assistance comes in, it can build around that structure. It can act as a coordinating device. So that for me is what you need to do, is build the structures and then cajole everybody else to bring in their help around that structure.
Same here. I'm also in more coordinating meetings than I would ever like to experience, and based on what I just hear from you both, we will probably need more coordinating meetings to coordinate among all of us, because there are many different initiatives to collect those data for different purposes. What we need is a clear focal point. And this clear focal point needs to be in Ukraine and needs to be led by Ukraine. And until they do it, what we will be doing is just spinning in circles and having our coordination meetings. So someone in Kyiv needs to step in and say, well, that's the focal point, that's the hub, that's the unit, that's the place. And then we will come to them.
Do you have time for one more question, or should we stop? Okay, I'm afraid we have to stop. One more. Okay, please. Patiently.
Andrei Luzhnetsky, president of the Ukrainian Society of Switzerland. I think one element missing from the discussion here is that, let's not forget, Russia was the guarantor of security of Ukraine. They signed the Budapest Memorandum, they signed the Treaty of Friendship, they're in the Security Council of the United Nations. I think extra measures need to be taken to show the guarantor of security that when they're the ones creating the atrocities, the war crimes, the genocide, it's as if the police got out of control. We need to take extra measures and put into other laws. They've been instrumentalizing the United Nations and other organizations. So it seems to me like International War Crimes Tribunal in Mariupol would be the best way to bring all of these crimes to light.
I mean, the other way of phrasing it, it's also the first time, unless they are the defeated party in a conflict the way that Japan and Germany was, they are a major power, whereas in all these other cases you talking about Rwanda, Serbia, Syria, which are small powers. So that seems to add a complication as well as maybe raises the stakes.
Does it have any bearing? Should it have any bearing?
I'm an historian, sorry.
Well, I mean, it does have a bearing. I mean, it's, I don't, it's hard to say this as a human rights lawyer, but I mean, Russia needs to be defeated on the battlefield. That's how these cases, in the end, succeed. A regime change in Russia caused by some kind of defeat, whatever that looks like, then we'll have a trial, and hopefully we'll have the suspects turned over to that trial. And I would say just one last thing. People say international justice can't work, you can't get hold of the people, and that is almost certainly true in the case of Russia, but that's in the hands of the international community. There should be no business, there should be no return to normal business with, if Putin has his off-ramp, whatever that means, if there is a peace agreement, that shouldn't mean we go back to business as usual. He is likely to be a serious war criminal. So why should we go back to business as normal? Sanctions, isolation, until they comply with international law, which is to investigate those who are suspected of international crimes. For me, it's as simple as that, and it rests in the will of the international community.
So to state the obvious, it makes it harder.
It makes it harder.
Okay. Thank you so much to all the panelists. Yuriy Belousov from CAVE, thank you so much for joining us. Eugene Finkel and Wayne Jordash. Another round of applause for this panel. Thank you.